I was thinking specifically of two summer incidents involving deer, one indescribably sweet and the other funny in a painful way. Both times I'd been fishing in a canoe. There's something about canoes. They do not cause fear. It is possible to paddle gently up to many wild animals and then simply stand and watch. This is the same thing happens often with dog teams. The silence is probably the cause, but there is grace to a canoe, or a dog team, or a sailboat, which whales follow close to them, a gentle elegance that seems to fit much more into nature than the roar of an outboard or snowmobile. Perhaps for that reason in many states it's illegal to hunt from a canoe, deemed unfair, and the same law would apply to dog teams. One early summer we had friends visiting us from the city. I took the man and his 4-year-old son out into the canoe to work some crappie beds. This morning the crappies were best in close to shore, and we caught 7 or 8 good ones by hanging right onto the edge of the lily pads and casting out to the deeper side. The water was very shallow where the canoe floated, and not over a foot deep, and the man and I were busy fishing while the young boy, who couldn't cast yet, was having more fun hanging a lure over the shallow side and watching dozens of small sunfish come to it and nibble. It was so quiet the water looked plated with the sky, and absolutely quiet except for the loon that let go once in a while before diving with a high, keen wail and whoop that is so wonderfully soft and melancholy. I was just working my lure in close to the boat when I heard the boy giggle quietly, and I turned to see him reaching out to touch a fawn. She was new, maybe 2, 3 weeks old, still red with camouflage spots. She walked down to the water slowly, one careful step at a time, and stretched her nose to touch the finger the boy was holding out, as if they were old friends. It was very deliberate, a youngster meeting another youngster, and I was afraid to breathe lest the moment be broken. I looked up quickly to signal the father, but he was already seeing it. His eyes were shining with it, and the moment hung in silence, a moment so incredible in all the moments there are that it seemed magic, staged. When they had touched, the fawn turned and walked slowly back up the hazel brush, where I could see the mother, frantic with worry, trying to get at her baby to come back, and then it was done. Silence for a long time. Even the small boy was silent. Finally I coughed. "It's all part of the Disneyland North," I said. "The fawn comes out on a rail and you touch it and it goes back." But it was not time for jokes, and I let it fall. We just sat for a time, watching the hazel brush where the fawn and mother had disappeared, and I had one long, intense moment of gratitude that is still going on, gratitude that I have seen such a thing. The second time I was canoeing down a flat, winding river that cuts through the woods like a sluggish snake. I had gear in the canoe for a week, and I was trying to catch muskie so I could let it go. I do not understand why I was doing this either. I have never caught a muskie, so I let it go, though I have tried several thousand casts and have to a large degree stopped trying to catch a muskie so that I can let it go. It seemed almost a vision quest for a time, but it is fading now as I get older, and the muskie I didn't catch gets bigger, while the muskie I did catch, none, gets smaller. It was an incredibly hot day. A late August sun seemed to boil the river, and the deer flies and horseflies were not to be believed. I have never seen them worse. It must have been a peak in their cycle. They formed a thick cloud around the canoe so that at times it was impossible to even see the bank. They all bit hard, and the blood smell from the bites brought more of them. They drank repellent like Kool-Aid, licked it off, and took more. I tried lighting a smudge in a tin can in the middle of the canoe as I paddled, which worked for mosquitoes, but it didn't bother the flies at all. They just kept eating, and soon my exposed arms and face and hands were bloody. By accident, I discovered a partial solution. The canoe slipped into the shade under some overhanging cedars, and if by design some of the flies moved away, backed out again into the sun to fly along and wait for me to come out again. In this manner I moved down the river, grabbing shade close in when I could. I was sliding under a leaning cedar, and when suddenly there was a tremendous crashing sound to my right. I hardly had time to turn when a doe launched herself from the bank of the thick brush on the bank into a magnificent arc that carried her out and up, higher than my head, to crash in the shallow water near the bank. Even in the split second of the event, I could see the flies. They were horrendous, a thick mass of them on her head, a swarm trailing back like a comet's tail as she flew through the air. Flies packed into her ears, into her eyes. Flies to drive her mad, insane, temporarily blind. She had no idea I was there. She landed so close she drenched me with water, but in her mad run she had left the bank blind, wanting only to get in the water and away from the maddening flies. She jammed her head under water and slammed it viciously back and forth in a swirling motion, then raised it. She snapped it out of the water and was looking straight into my eyes from a distance of 4 or 5 feet. Everything, breath, heart, everything, was absolutely still. Even the flies seemed to stop. I have never seen such anger, such defiance compressed into a single moment. The flies had taken her beyond control, and when she saw me, her eyes opened wide in surprise, then seemed to narrow in cold rage. She didn't care I was a man, the enemy. Didn't care I was there. She was only an arm's reach away. She didn't care about anything right then except for the flies. Her eyes, her manners, all things about her for that moment seemed to say, "Mess with me and you're a dead man." Raw, irritated, frustrated, ripping anger. I didn't move, and in that very short time she realized what I was, blew out of the water in a fountain spray and bottom mud, and was gone. I thought of her now on the cold night, remembered the wonderfully hot sun cooking down on my back as I paddled. Even the flies seemed to be from the warmth somehow. Musing, lost in the scene, I did not notice that the dogs were slowing and had stopped until my stomach rammed into the handlebar of the sled. "Pick it up," I said, which usually snapped them into motion, but this time they didn't move. The leader whined in unease, and the 2 wheel dogs, the dogs pulling directly in front of the sled, turned and tried to climb back onto the sled. With their motion, several of the dogs began to growl, and I felt nervousness come back from the dogs and into me. They acted this way before, usually when they'd run into a moose in the dark. We'd been attacked by a moose on a few occasions, and it was not something I wished to do again. Moose are large and essentially insane with an almost pathological hatred of dogs, the sled, the musher, trees, trains, cars, and everything else as near as I can figure. When they come at you, it's like getting run over by a Buick with legs. I wish I was some other place. The nervousness of the team increased, and I knew I would have to deal with it, so I set the snow hook and walked up alongside the dogs, flashing my headlamp ahead, trying to see around the slight curve of the lead dog. He was stopped in the middle of the trail, with all his hair up, his lips barred, growling low in his throat. Ahead of him, slightly to the side of the trail, stood a doe. She was absolutely still, looking straight ahead over the dog. None of this made sense. Number 1, a deer would not stand so still that close, 4 or 5 feet, to a dog. Number 2, the dog would not normally have hesitated. He would have been on the deer or tried to get at her, and the other dogs would join in. You never moved so fast on a run as when a deer jumped out in front of the team and bolted down the trail. They fairly flew without trying to catch it. And here all of them were whimpering and cowering, spooked by one doe, who was standing absolutely still. And I was getting spooked by her. She had stood staring across the dogs as if they weren't there. I pushed the dogs sideways on the trail and made my way slowly to the front, closer to the deer. There weren't 3 feet between her and the lead dog, who was still whining. And still she did not move. Finally, I stood so close I could touch her. The light from my headlamp hit her in the eyes. They were fogged with death. I could see that she was dead, standing dead in the night wind next to the trail, guarding the winter night. She had frozen solid on her feet, exactly as if she was alive, perfectly still and upright. It could not be, yet was. I looked for many things in my mind to explain it. A sudden heart attack, freak paralysis. I tried to think of all the possibilities, but it still did not make sense. We could not stay. I could not bring myself to go closer to her, and when I pulled the leader forward and lined him out on the trail and pulled the hook, the team shot past the dead doe without looking up, staring at the ground, not barking or lunging to get at her, but moving as fast as possible, moving away from that place.